When learning a new software, in this case Cavalry, it can be quite overwhelming to open it and not understand what a single element does. So in this video, I'll walk you through the user interface, and by the end you'll know what each panel is used for and be ready to start creating. Additionally, throughout the video, I'll show you some shortcuts to set you up for a better workflow. Now, if you haven't watched episode 1 of this series yet, go watch that first. With that out of the way, let's open up Cavalry. For someone completely new to creative software, this might look intimidating, but we'll take one panel at a time, starting with the Assets panel. And this consists most importantly of the compositions, but also assets like images or photos or files. And you can see the details of a composition here, which is a scene or an animation. Now, to add these external assets, you can right click on the middle here and hit import assets, or you can just drag assets in. You can see the file path down here, and you can also add groups by clicking this icon, or instead by hitting Ctrl G while selecting some things. More importantly, you can create new compositions by clicking this button. And now you sort of have two scenes or two animations. And to showcase this, I have now two compositions, one adding a cube, and you can see the difference here by hovering over them. To delete a composition, you can click delete, or you can go down to this trash can icon. At this point, you might ask, what is a composition? Well, if we take a look at the next panel here, which is the viewport or the composition view, we can actually see what it is. It is basically everything we're going to see in the animation. If we have some rectangles in the animation, they're going to show up here, and it sort of works as a drawing board or a canvas. We can also see a few details below it here, as well as a settings tool over here where we can open it and see a few settings, but they're not really relevant for the beginner right now. Then we can over here see the zoom value, as well as something quite important, which is the composition settings. Opening it, we'll see quite a few settings, but only the top ones are really important. Here we have the resolution we can change, and we can also see the frame range, i.e. how long the animation is going to be, as well as the frame rate and the background color, which we can change here. Below that is most importantly the motion blur, but it's not really anything we're going to use right now, but only later in the series. And the settings you choose here will only be on that set composition. And that's it for the viewport. Now we can move on to the next panel, which is the toolbar. And think of this as a toolbox with everything that's relevant to creating on your canvas. And this can, for example, be the pencil tool, or more importantly, we have stuff like the camera for pro users, but nothing that we're going to touch in this series. Then we also have text and a lot of shapes like the rectangle, and you can click them, and then they sort of work as both. You can click them to add a shape, but also drag them to change the size. You can also hold Alt while clicking them to quickly add a shape into the middle. And you can use a shortcut V to go back to the select tool, which is quite useful. To this you might ask, how do you structure these things? And for that, Cavalry uses the layer panel. And if you add a cube or a rectangle or a text object, you'll see they appear down in the layer panel right here. And these layers aren't just going to be randomly shown there. They are organized in a layer, meaning that the bottommost layer is going to be beneath all other layers in the composition. Now, selecting the lip shape, we can see it selected in the viewport as well. And if we try to drag the Cavalry text here over the rectangle, we'll see it's beneath, and that's because it's also beneath in the layer panel. We can then drag it above to see that it also changes in the viewport. And to the left here, we have this little visibility icon, which will turn off the visibility, but it won't delete it. It's just going to hide it. Then we can also lock a layer to make it not move, which is quite useful. And then we can also change the layer color here, which is going to be quite useful to distinguish one type from another. Now, before moving on to a more interesting panel, you can also drag one object into another to make it a child of that object or a layer. And you can also group them like in the assets layer. And now we can move on to the attribute editor, which is where you can change the attributes of, for example, a rectangle. So having a rectangle selected, you'll see that we have this box on the left with a lot of different settings. We right now have live mode activated, which means that it's just automatically going to show the rectangle because we have it selected. Disabling that, we can, by double clicking multiple layers, see them all here in the attribute editor. And for this, we only really need to have one, so we can enable live mode again. And here we see some different tabs for the rectangle shape. These can change depend on the type, but this is the usual. Now, this is basically the details of an object. We can change the position here, we can rotate it, scale it, and to scale both the X and Y axis, you can hold Alt while dragging. Then you can go ahead and use something like skew or pivot, and there's a lot of things in here. But what you need to understand about this is that it's where you can change all of the parameters of a layer and also animate them. We also have the deformers and filters, which are subjects of their own and take a long time to cover, which I'm going to do in a upcoming video. But as an example, you can add something like a drop shadow filter, as you can see on the right here. Then we also have like a wave deformer, but I'm going to go over that in more detail later. You can also add motion blur here, and you can change the primitive type if you don't want a rectangle anymore, but some other primitive. Then you can change the size here, which is often better practice than scaling it. And you can also add some corner radius, which is sort of a bevel on the corners of an object. Now, that's basically it for the first tab, shape. And we can now move on to fill, which is even easier to understand. And what it basically is just colors. So you can change the color of an object, but you can also add shaders like a gradient or a noise shader and so on. Stroke works sort of the same way as fill, but you also have options with the width of a stroke and how it should look like with a dash pattern and so on. And then we can take a look at masks, which is not really for this beginner guide, but it's there, and then some advanced settings. And we can see the change in these tabs. If we, for example, add another type of object, we can add the text by holding Alt and clicking it, and now see some different types of things in here, like the string, where we can change it to text. And you can also see that we have a new tab here called background, where we can add a background to some text. So it changes a bit depending on what layer you're working with. But everything so far has been sort of static. So to move closer to actually making a small animation in the end, we need to take a look at the time editor. And to showcase this, I'm gonna create a little shape here, and once it's created, it will show down here in the time editor as this yellow bar indicating its visibility. And hitting play, nothing will happen, and that's because no behaviors or keyframes are affecting its movement. So we can add a keyframe at position 0 and on frame 0, then move the frame to 60, and then move the position to 100. And now it automatically adds a second keyframe, and it now creates some movement between those two keyframes. And that's the basics of the time editor. However, this animation looked quite boring and linear. And to fix that, we need to take a look at the graph editor, which is this little tab right here. And right now it's empty, but to showcase what it can do, we can just recreate the exact animation from before with the two keyframes for the position here. And selecting the position right here on the layer panel, we'll now see that we have this line and it's completely straight going upwards. Hitting Shift 2 on it while we have it selected, we'll see that it creates this curve indicating how fast it moves. And it changes speed, which is going to make it look quite nicer. And we can also change the frame rate here on the composition settings, and it'll now look much more interesting. And we are definitely going to go more in detail with animation later in this series, but for now let's just take a look at also this looping button, which will loop the animation over and over again forever. Now, to briefly just touch on the easing we did before with Shift 5, you can also hit Shift 1 to disable the magic easing completely, then right click and you can use key interpolation on the Bezier instead to have more control over it. But don't worry, we're going to cover that in a later video in more detail. For now, we're done with the timeline panel, and we can move on to the next panel, which is the color panel. And this doesn't actually only consist of the color, but more on that later. Right now, if you select the rectangle shape, you can see we have this color wheel over here. You can change the color by going over to the fill here and changing it here, but it's a little easier to do it over here, and you can also do other things than just changing the color, because once you found a color you like, you can see that we have these swatches and sort of palettes, and you can drag one color you like into that palette or swatch so it's easy to access later, and you can also create multiple swatches or palettes that you use for different projects. Along with the swatches tab, you also have something called the generator, and we can access that by hitting this generator button right here. And this will go out from the color you currently have selected in the color wheel, and you can now create different gradients or arrays of colors using this palette you've just created. And this is quite useful for using something like a duplicator, which I'm going to cover in a later episode. For now, it's just that you know it's there. But this panel we're looking at right now doesn't only consist of color changes. We can also do something a little more useful for you maybe, which is to add layers. And to do that, we need to go up and change it from color to the add layers. And here you will see all the layers and different deformers and utilities and filters and everything in Cavalry assembled into one long list. And this can be quite overwhelming. So I like to access it by hitting this plus icon, or instead by hitting Control period. And here you can search for whatever you want instead. And this is quite useful, so you don't need to look around in menus for one little thing, but can just search for it. Along with this, we also have the Align panel down here, which is quite self-explanatory. It aligns itself with either the corners or the middle and so on. We can also do something which is distributed, and for this we need to have multiple objects. So we can hit Ctrl D to add multiple objects, and now they're not really evenly distributed, but we can hit this button to evenly distribute them. And the difference between the three is that the first one is going to horizontally distribute them, second one is going to do it vertically, and the third one is going to do it on both axes. And now we can delete the two other cubes here, and you'll see the center one here is actually off center, so we can use the alignment to fix that. And now we can move on to this top bar here. More precisely, up in the right corner, we have a lot of different buttons, and what they are is sort of shortcuts for things you might often use. For example, we have the duplicator here, and we have auto animate deformer, we have the align behavior, and we also have a text along a path. And what they'll allow us to do is to, while having an object selected, we can click these buttons to quickly add a deformer to something, or a setup that might take more actions to do, but you often do. And it's quite useful to be known with these shortcuts, especially the duplicator one, which I'm going to talk about in a later video. And now we can move on to the last part of the UI, which is these menus up in the top left. And they are actually quite simple to understand, at least the ones you need to use, which is more often than not only the file one. Now, there are really a lot of things underneath each one of these menus, as you can see here, but Really, the only one you need to get familiar with is the file and also partly the edit one. Now, to first of all take a look at the file, we have stuff like new scene. We can open a file, we can save files, which is obviously very important. We can import assets and also do stuff like project settings if you have that. And you can also do the render manager, which is arguably the most important thing after saving this, which is where you render your final animation, which is also accessed by hitting Alt B. And because you're going to use this so much, let's also go into the render manager to just show briefly what it looks like. Here you can add a current composition, and then you can change your settings, and then you can hit render all. And I also have more videos on rendering if you want to watch those. Now, along with that, we also have the edit tab, which in here you might find preferences useful if there's some little thing about the UI that you want to change the color of or the size of. Now, let's create a small animation to actually see what we've learned so far. So start off with a rectangle that you can change the color or add some bevel. Let's move that wherever you want. And let's add some keyframes to the rotation and the position at frame 0. Then let's move the playhead to frame 100, and let's move the cube all the way over to the other side of the screen. You can also change the rotation here to maybe, let's say it's gonna do a full rotation by the end. Then to make it not so boring of an animation, let's select these 3 attributes, and under the graph editor we can drag over all of the keyframes, and we can see right now it's quite boring of an animation. And previously we used magic easing to make this animation look nicer, but for some reason it doesn't work in this example. So let's right click, then hit key interpolation and use Bezier, where we can hold shift while dragging on one of these dots to make the easing manually. And we can drag it even more to make it more of a rapid moment in the middle. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Cavalry, stay tuned for my next episode of the Beginner's Guide to Cavalry, and consider subscribing to get notified once a new video drops. Thanks for watching.